Alright you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, this one's going to be a little bit different. So a lot of you have asked questions in the past about Frank Joker Mendoza from Redondo Beach. You've asked me to do a profile on him, and some of you wanted to know more about his role in several historical incidents that he was personally involved in. To be quite honest with you guys, I've never done a profile on him because I obviously didn't know him personally myself, and there just wasn't a lot of information out there about him. He's one of those types of characters that was involved in a lot of different incidents throughout the past, but nobody has ever really put things in context. Or if it is out there, I at least haven't been able to find it. And therefore, a level of mystique continues to remain about him and the monumental role that he has played in NF history. At any rate, the closest I could find is to share with you the personal interactions and observations of yet another major player in NF history who was also one of Joker's proteges. Hector Copas from Salinas was someone who actually looked up to Joker, and Joker was his mentor. Copas was closer to my era and was someone who I actually had the privilege to work with over the years. So the following information was gathered from Copas himself. A lot of what's mentioned here came directly from him, and this is all based off of his personal interactions and observations. I told you guys before that I had always heard that Copas was one of the original creators that drafted up the NR, Nuestra Raza. Copas confirmed that he was the one who came up with the idea of creating the NR, and that Big Manos, who I believe is Michael Sosa, and Cornelio Tristan, Corny from Woodland, were also instrumental in the drafting process. Copas said that the intended purpose for creating the NR was a training base for prospective candidates who would later be considered for NF membership. This took place in Folsom. Black Bob, Chente, Pinky, Manos, Manzanas, and a couple other N's were present when this movement was still in the embryonic stages. Keep in mind that this spiel by Copas wasn't a full profile of Joker, as he doesn't nearly go into all the things he was involved in. Even some of the more noteworthy incidents are not mentioned, such as the incident involving Cheyenne that took place in Palm Hall. This was more about some of Copas' observations about Joker's psychological state and the dark corners of his mind. I believe Joker would later meet his violent demise somewhere in Corcoran. From what I remember, he was celled up with a guy from Fresno who would end up beating Joker to death behind some form of disrespect. By this time, Joker was old and was losing what mental abilities he had left, but he died in the same violent way that he had inflicted on many others. The following is compiled from Copas' personal observations and interactions. Man Without Fear, the Joker. Soon after the Palm Hall incident with Cheyenne, it was an all-out war between the NF and the MA. This one incident in the conflict literally led to an all-out bloodbath and intensified the war on a level that had never been seen before. Up until this point, the California Department of Corrections assumed that the escalation in violence were attributed to sporadic attacks between these two groups. However, nobody anticipated that this was the beginning of a war that would span over the course of several decades. Gang members affiliated with either faction were scattered to shoes throughout the Department of Corrections. The logic, according to CDC, was to disrupt any conspiratorial plots being planned by gang members. The killing of Cheyenne dealt a significant blow to the MA's ego. The MA had a hard enough time coming to grips with the fact that another group took out a high-ranking member of their organization, such as Cheyenne. But what hurt even more is that this was done by a group of fameros, who the MA considered to be inferior. The majority of Mexican Mafia members were from Southern California, and they considered themselves to be big-time city slickers. However, this new group that was emerging were made up primarily of Raza from Northern California, who were considered to be field workers, sod busters, who were from small towns and cities in rural Northern California. Killing within the prison system at that time was commonplace. Bodies were being dropped daily, so this was nothing new. But gang investigators throughout the state began compiling information about how this one murder in Palm Hall might have had the potential to take this conflict to a level that they had never seen before in the California prison system. Based on this information, CDC's response was rapid, and they didn't take any chances. Anyone who was identified as a member of one of these two groups, or anyone who supposedly had any influence, was removed from the general population main lines and was swiftly placed in the SHU, segregated housing units. A total of 15 members of the Nuestra Familia ended up in San Quentin SHU B Block in 1973. Joker from Redondo Beach and Copas from Salas were just two to name. The main line during that time was controlled by the VENMO. The war had become so intense, the rules of engagement were simple: attack the enemy on sight. Anytime you had an opportunity to engage with the opposition, you did. Each time Copas, Joker, or any of the other NF members were ducketed to medical or to the visiting area, the guards were under orders not to handcuff them during escort. Their hands were left free to defend themselves in case of an attack by the VENMO. The guards did not want to get caught up in the mix, but at the same time, they implemented these unwritten radical policies to at least give these guys a fighting chance. Otherwise, they were leading them to a slaughter. The analogy would be comparable to walking a sheep through a pack of hungry wolves. After a number of these kamikaze-style attacks, the cuffs were then taken off whenever an escort was taking place. But the same thing was going on in DVI, only at this prison, the roles were reversed. This prison was controlled by the NF, and there was a heavy presence of both its members and sympathizers there. Suicide missions of this sort became common in basically every prison across the state. The hit-on-sight policy. Back then, San Quentin was notorious in comparison to other prisons. It was there where Joker and Copas became more than brothers in arms. They shared a solid friendship. Joker became instrumental in tutoring Copas in the way of the convict. This went well above and beyond the NF indoctrination and the intensive NF training that Copas would later be exposed to. Joker taught Copas how to be a convict, and he helped instill some of the same characteristics that he believed in himself. Though not much older than Copas, Joker was wise beyond his years. He was very articulate, an artist, and very well read. He admired the writings and teachings of Sun Tzu, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Niccolo Machiavelli. He was respected and revered by his comrades, feared and detested by his enemies. Attributed to having killed 2 convicts in separate knife attacks, he was considered dangerous and criminally insane by the prison administration. Copas, however, personally did not think of him in that way. Copas also thought of him as an excellent role model, someone who he could learn so much from. Although somewhat arrogant in his invincible way of thinking, he nonetheless was a man you did not want to underestimate, and surely not one you'd want to cross. There was a silent mystique about him that told you he wasn't someone you'd want to have as an enemy. According to those who were present in one of his stabbings, Joker was observed to be enjoying the moment he plunged a prison-made weapon over and over into the other prisoner's chest area. One of the guards who witnessed the stabbing repeatedly yelled for Joker to get off him, stop. The guard was in hysterics and shock by what he was witnessing. Joker paused for a moment to look up at the guard and replied in a cold and deliberate manner, "It's what I'm trying to do," and continued on with the assault. When Joker was satisfied that the victim he had been stabbing was in fact dead, he stood up, drenched in blood, and tossing his weapon to one side, he said, "Okay, I'm done, let's go." Meaning he was ready to go to solitary confinement, his mission having been accomplished. In his second kill, he had stabbed his target so many times it was said that the inmate being stabbed was overheard telling Joker to stop. "Stop, I'm already dead," as if he were speaking to Joker from beyond the world of the living. Joker seemed empowered by the idea that other prisoners knew he would not hesitate to take a life at the drop of a hat. So according to Copas, he recalled when one time a guard commented, "What do you do to a man who fears nothing?" Copas would later come to learn that Joker's state of mind and condition was not unique in itself. As the years rolled by, he would bear witness to other guys having that same thirst for bloodshed. But that was Joker, alright, invincible, afraid of nothing, nor anyone. It's funny how the guard's comment, "What to do to a man who fears nothing," would remain in Copas' mind's memory for many years to come. Years later, Copas would come face to face with the guard's comment, but from an entirely different perspective. A couple of years later, Joker and Copas would later part ways. Copas was then transferred to Soledad Central's O Wing, where he would hook up with Death Row Joe and further temper and fine-tune Copas' character as a soldado for the NF. Copas became so entrenched in the idea of what a representative of the NF should be like that he turned his concept into an obsession. Copas, along with a few others, began to compete with one another to see who could acquire the most notches under their belts. Pinky 7. DC and Copas had formed a small wrecking crew. They were all arrested in Bakersfield in 1977-1978. Pinky, Chente, and DC escaped out of the Kern County Jail while awaiting trial. Copas was being held in Merced County on an unrelated case, from where he also escaped. The county jails must have been wide open back in those days, because if I remember correctly, I think Brown Bob had escaped from one of the county jails as well. It might have been Monterey County Jail. So at one point, they were all on the run. Copas was the last one to eventually get caught. Pinky ended up getting railroaded because he didn't deserve the time he got resulting out of the Bakersfield case. Copas would later claim that he tried to persuade Pinky into pursuing a new trial surrounding newly discovered evidence, but that Pinky was hard-headed and allowed time to consume him, picking up new cases where the newly discovered evidence no longer mattered. Had he pursued it, he had a good chance of reversing that conviction, but that's an entirely different story. Anyhow, Copas had become so obsessed with the idea of becoming the ultimate soldado that, in the process, he completely severed ties with all his loved ones in the outside world. He was so immersed in the thick of warfare and didn't want the distractions that come with the worries and concerns of those in the outside world. Little did he know then that he was on the dangerous path of becoming a misanthropic, a hater of mankind, antisocial, a cynic, a recluse, emotionally calloused. At one point, he even requested to go on a suicide mission for Death Row Joe, but he would not allow it. Copas even pushed the issue, but again, he denied the proposal. It was never brought up again. Even though the suicide mission never materialized, Copas would later say that he would not elaborate on it because of its sensitivity. In retrospect, Copas would later also say that he was glad Death Row Joe had denied that request. One could believe that he may possibly have denied that request because he may have already been entertaining the thought of betraying the O. Sure enough, he took that step and rolled over. Not only did he expose all the inner workings of the NF to the FBI, but he also gave them documented information and photographs of every member in the NF. Information that would later become public information. Information that could easily fall into the enemy's hands. Death Row Joe also managed to run off with hundreds of thousands of dollars. In any event, Joker and Copas stayed in touch for a short while after. But as the years rolled by, they eventually lost touch with one another. It happens. Like a lot of us, they got caught up in the fragmented mindset of prison life and began living it day by day, hour by hour. When one is transferred from one prison to the next, amid all of the chaos, you often have the tendency of losing property items, such as personal pictures and addresses. And in the mix of it, this is when you gradually lose touch with friends and loved ones. That's basically what happened to them. 10 years later, Copas would once again find himself back in San Quentin. And of course, the first person he would be looking forward to seeing again was Joker. Unfortunately, true of time in itself, things and people change. But this particular change threw Copas for a loop. Comrades who had known Joker as he once had began to tell him that Joker was no longer the same person he had once known. However, no one could really tell him the true cause of Joker's transformation. Some said he simply just checked in. Others said he mysteriously vanished into oblivion in solitary confinement, sitting in darkness, afraid of his own shadow. Initially, Copas didn't accept anything negative he was being told about him, but then to his shocking disappointment, he came to find out the truth, or a shaky version of what the truth actually was. One morning on his way to one of the segregated recreation cages, he managed to pass by a cell, and sure enough, there he sat at the edge of his bunk toward the back of the cell. Copas called out to him, but he just sat there in the dark, no reaction whatsoever. He didn't even acknowledge him, and Copas would also say that he didn't think he even remembered who he was. This is when the comment, "What do you do to a man who fears nothing?" came back to haunt him. Returning back to his cell, he couldn't get what he had witnessed out of his head. It bothered him deeply. He was gripped by the pressing need to find out what it was that caused him to become like that. He needed to know because he wanted to understand. From my own observations of Copas, I've always known him to have been an inquisitive individual by nature. This is one of the characteristics that has always made him a good leader. If something didn't make sense to him or something just wasn't right about an issue or an individual, he would always seek an answer or reasoning to its content. The lack of understanding of what happened to his close friend, Joker, instilled in him a sense of insecurity he obviously had never known before. The thought and fear of what had happened to Joker could one day easily happen to him. So from that day forward, he embarked on a mission to find out why. And thus, this is when the search was on. In truth, to this day, he remains at a loss. As close as he would ever come to finding a half-assed measure of understanding, it came by way of Bertrand Russell's quotations, which read, "Men fear thought as they fear nothing else on earth. Thought is subversive and revolutionary, destructive and terrible. Thought is merciless to privileged, established institutions and comfortable habits. Thought is anarchic and lawless, indifferent, careless of the well, tried wisdom of ages. Thought looks into the pit of hell and is not afraid. Thought is great and swift and free, the light of the world and the chief glory of man." Dean Koontz brings it closer to home. He wrote, "Sometimes there is no darker place than our own thoughts, the moonless midnight of the mind." Joker was a man of thought, and yes, a man who feared nothing. Prison is time, time is thought. Copas believed that thought and misplaced fearlessness in the end consumed him. Perhaps in thought he began to think of himself as invincible. Only God is invincible. One is led to believe that in his desire of being greater than man himself, there came an implosion of the human spirit which put a stop to his madness, of his pursuit towards invincibility. This is the analogy that Copas came away with. He had nothing else to draw from. I'm sure to think that he once looked up to this man as a role model was a rude awakening. No man can live like that, nor should he. Our purpose in this world is not to compete with the likeness of God, but to strive forth in his image. Copas also came away with the realization of how little he really knew about how one should lead his life. There is so much that we all have yet to learn. One thing that Copas said he did know for sure is that he had to tread lightly from here on in search of his own truth and reasoning, lest he too could have become consumed in foolish and dangerous thought. I hope you guys have enjoyed this piece on Joker from Redondo Beach. Give me your thoughts and tell me what you think in the comments. With that said, you guys stay tapped into the channel. I'm going to be making another announcement in the community section, as Paradigm Media News is going to be collaborating with Farmland Bullies to give away another American bully. With that being said, thank you guys for tapping in. This your boy B, and I'm out.